When a middle power like Colombia starts talking about war, we should stop and pay attention. This is not about Colombia alone, it's a signal, one more data point telling us that the rules of the international system are changing, and not in ways that favor stability. Multipolarity reduces great power control over regional conflicts because power is no longer concentrated enough to discipline allies, deter opportunism, or impose clear red lines. When one dominant state sits at the top of the system, smaller states calculate their behavior with that reality in mind, knowing that reckless moves can trigger punishment or abandonment. In a multipolar world, that disciplining effect weakens. Multiple great powers compete, their attention is divided, and their ability to manage distant regions declines. This creates strategic slack, and regional actors quickly learn how to exploit it. They test boundaries, escalate disputes, and pursue local objectives with less fear of immediate retaliation from a system manager that no longer exists. As power diffuses, great powers become selective about where they invest resources, which conflicts they prioritize, and which partners they are willing to defend. This selectivity sends mixed signals. Regional states interpret hesitation as opportunity and ambiguity as permission. The result is not chaos, but competition, localized, intense, and increasingly autonomous. Conflicts that were once frozen or suppressed under great power oversight begin to thaw. Old rivalries resurface and new ones emerge, driven by shifts in local balances rather than global ideological contests. Control erodes not because great powers disappear, but because they can no longer be everywhere at once. In this environment, alliances lose their stabilizing function. Guarantees become conditional, credibility becomes uncertain, and promises are hedged with caveats. Smaller states respond rationally by taking matters into their own hands. They arm themselves, form temporary alignments, and act preemptively against perceived threats. Great powers may disapprove, but disapproval is not deterrence. Without the willingness or capability to enforce restraint, influence fades. This is especially dangerous in regions where historical grievances, weak institutions, and internal fragmentation already exist. Multipolarity does not create these problems, but it removes the external pressure that once kept them in check. Another consequence is the rise of strategic freelancing. Regional actors learn to play great powers against one another, extracting support while avoiding full alignment. This further undermines control. When no single patron dominates, leverage declines for all of them. Local conflicts become bargaining chips rather than liabilities, tools to attract attention or resources rather than problems to be resolved. Violence, in this sense, becomes instrumental. It is no longer just about security, but about positioning within a crowded and competitive system. Great powers themselves contribute to this erosion of control by prioritizing relative gains over system stability. In a multipolar world, they worry less about managing the system and more about outperforming rivals. This shifts incentives away from conflict suppression and toward opportunistic engagement. Supporting a regional actor becomes less about peace and more about denying influence to competitors. The logic is brutally simple. If instability weakens your rival's position, it may be tolerable, even useful. Over time, this mindset normalizes disorder at the regional level, even as great powers insist rhetorically on stability. The deeper problem is that multipolar systems generate misalignment between global interests and regional realities. Great powers think in terms of balance, deterrence, and long-term competition, while regional states think in terms of immediate threats, survival, and domestic pressures. Without a dominant power to bridge that gap, misunderstandings multiply. Control gives way to influence gives way to persuasion, and persuasion often fails under conditions of fear. What remains is a world where regional conflicts are less predictable, harder to contain, and far more likely to escalate on their own terms. Middle powers act more aggressively under uncertainty because the erosion of clear hierarchies forces them to rely on self help rather than external guarantees. And in international politics, self help rewards initiative, not restraint. When the distribution of power becomes unclear, these states cannot accurately predict who will protect them, who will abandon them, or who will exploit their weakness. Uncertainty magnifies threat perception, and leaders respond not by waiting, but by moving first. From a realist standpoint, this behavior is not reckless but rational, because in an anarchic system, hesitation can be fatal. Middle powers lack the luxury of strategic patience enjoyed by great powers, so they compensate with speed, signaling, and coercive action to shape their environment before rivals do. Aggression, in this sense, is a form of insurance against strategic irrelevance. As uncertainty grows, so does the fear of encirclement, marginalization, or sudden shifts in alignment that leave a state exposed. Acting forcefully becomes a way to impose clarity where none exists. In a multipolar world, ambiguity replaces predictability, rules are contested, norms are selectively enforced, and deterrence becomes inconsistent. Middle powers operating in this environment cannot rely on stable expectations, so they adopt worst case assumptions. They prepare not for what is likely, but for what is possible. This pushes them toward military buildup, forward deployment, and preemptive postures. The goal is not conquest, but leverage. By demonstrating willingness to use force, they seek to deter threats, attract allies, and signal resolve to both friends and enemies. Aggression becomes communication. Silence is interpreted as weakness, and weakness invites pressure. Under these conditions, restraint is often misread as vulnerability rather than responsibility. Domestic politics further intensify this dynamic. Leaders of middle powers face internal audiences that demand security, sovereignty, and prestige. In uncertain systems, nationalist narratives gain traction, and external threats are amplified to justify consolidation of power. Aggressive foreign policy becomes a tool for domestic legitimacy, especially when economic or social pressures limit other avenues of control. This does not mean leaders manufacture threats, but that uncertainty makes it easier to frame risks as existential. Once framed that way, compromise becomes politically costly and escalation becomes easier to justify. The international system rewards strength, and domestic politics punish perceived weakness, creating a feedback loop that pushes middle powers toward assertive behavior. Another driver is the fear of being sidelined by great power competition. In multipolar systems, middle powers worry that decisions affecting their security will be made without them. To avoid irrelevance, they create facts on the ground. They intervene, escalate disputes, or formalize rivalries to force recognition. Aggression becomes a strategy for visibility. If you matter enough to cause problems, you matter enough to be negotiated with. This logic encourages risk-taking, especially in regions where borders are contested and institutions are weak. The absence of a clear system manager means there is no authority to consistently punish these moves, lowering the perceived cost of escalation. Security competition replaces diplomatic restraint when the structure of the international system rewards power accumulation over trust and punishes hesitation more than provocation, and this shift becomes most visible as multipolarity deepens and uncertainty hardens into a permanent condition. In such an environment, diplomacy does not disappear, but it changes character, becoming tactical rather than transformative, a tool to buy time rather than resolve underlying conflicts. States continue to talk, negotiate and sign agreements, yet these actions are increasingly subordinated to military planning, alliance maneuvering, and competitive positioning. The core problem is that diplomacy depends on credible commitments, and credible commitments are extremely difficult to sustain when power is widely distributed and intentions are opaque. States cannot be sure that today's partner will not be tomorrow's rival, or that an agreement made under one balance of power will survive the next shift in capabilities. As a result, leaders hedge against diplomatic failure by prioritizing security measures that can be controlled directly, such as force posture, arms development, and strategic depth. This does not reflect a collapse of rationality, but a recognition that survival cannot be outsourced to goodwill in an anarchic system. As security competition intensifies, restraint begins to look naive rather than prudent. States interpret moderation not as a signal of peaceful intent, but as an admission of weakness or lack of resolve. This perception is especially dangerous because it incentivizes probing behavior. Rivals test boundaries precisely where restraint is most visible, assuming that a cautious state will prefer compromise over confrontation. Over time, this dynamic trains states to abandon self-imposed limits and adopt harder lines, not because they desire conflict, but because they fear exploitation. Diplomatic language remains, but it is increasingly backed by coercive signals, military exercises, economic pressure, and implicit threats. The message is clear. Negotiation is possible, but only from a position of strength. In this context, diplomacy becomes an extension of security competition rather than an alternative to it. Multipolar systems accelerate this transformation because no single power can enforce norms or punish violations consistently. When enforcement is uneven, rules lose their deterrent value. States learn that restraint is optional and that consequences depend on alignment rather than behavior. This erodes faith in institutions and agreements designed to manage conflict. Arms control regimes weaken, confidence building measures decay, and crisis management mechanisms become fragile. Security competition fills the vacuum left behind. States focus on relative gains, worrying less about whether an action destabilizes the system and more about whether it improves their position vis-a-vis rivals. Diplomatic restraint, which requires some willingness to absorb short-term costs for long-term stability, becomes politically and strategically unattractive. Domestic pressures reinforce this shift. Leaders operating under competitive security conditions face publics that are increasingly skeptical of compromise and sensitive to perceptions of national decline. Diplomatic concessions are framed as losses, while assertive security policies are framed as necessary defenses. Even when leaders privately recognize the risks of escalation, they are constrained by narratives that equate toughness with competence. This narrows the space for diplomacy and elevates the role of military and security institutions in policy making. Over time, bureaucratic incentives align around competition rather than cooperation, further marginalizing diplomatic restraint as a guiding principle. Another critical factor is the speed of modern strategic interaction. Advances in military technology, intelligence, and communication compress decision-making timelines and magnify the costs of delay. In fast-moving environments, leaders are less willing to rely on prolonged negotiation processes that may not keep pace with shifting realities. Security competition offers immediacy and control, while diplomacy appears slow and uncertain. This temporal pressure favors actions that can be executed unilaterally and reversed only at great cost, reinforcing a preference for hard power solutions. Once embedded, this mindset becomes self-reinforcing as each competitive move justifies the next. The deeper tragedy is that as security competition replaces diplomatic restraint, the capacity to de-escalate crises erodes. When states view each other primarily through a competitive lens, Signals of reassurance are discounted and warnings are amplified. Misinterpretation becomes more likely, and accidents become more dangerous. Yet, from a realist perspective, this outcome is not a failure of imagination or morality, but a structural consequence of the system. States do not abandon restraint because they want war, but because the logic of competition convinces them that restraint is too risky. In a world where power determines outcomes and uncertainty defines the future, security competition does not merely overshadow diplomacy, it redefines its limits, ensuring that restraint survives only where it is backed by force and where the balance of power makes it safe to practice. Crucially, middle powers understand that uncertainty is temporary, but outcomes are permanent. Waiting for clarity can mean accepting a disadvantageous status quo. Acting early, even aggressively, can lock in gains or prevent losses. This creates incentives for preemption rather than reaction. The tragedy is that when multiple states think this way simultaneously, insecurity spirals. Each move meant to increase safety makes others feel less secure. Yet, from the perspective of each individual actor, restraint appears irrational. In a world defined by uncertainty, aggression is not a deviation from realism, it is realism in its purest form.